Welcome, I'm Lauren from Zestful Kitchen, and welcome to the Everyday Gourmet, where I share realistic recipes for the avid home cook using fresh ingredients and global flavors. That was pretty good. Today we're making one of my most popular recipes. We're making my cabbage and sausage sheetpan dinner, and it takes the classic flavors of cabbage, sausage, and mustard, kind of modernizes it with sheetpan method, and then also a really tangy, herby shallot dressing that we drizzle over top. Super easy. It's all done on the sheet pan. It's all done in the oven, and I think you're really gonna love it. Okay, so I'm gonna get started on the prep. Okay, so first things first is we're going to just drizzle our baking sheet with a little bit of high heat neutral cooking oil. I'm using avocado oil, but you could also do vegetable oil. You just need a little bit so the cabbage doesn't stick. Just shy of a tablespoon. We're gonna need that again, so keep that out. And then I'm just gonna brush this with a pastry brush to coat it. You can also use your hands. You can also use the cabbage once we cut it to shimmy the oil around, but give that a light, thin coating. And then we're going to cut this up into wedges. So first things first, I might just trim this so it's not so unruly, but you do want to keep the stem intact. So place it like this and cut it into quarters. You're gonna want a very sharp knife. And then it gets easier from here. So then you can place it cut side down and cut it again. So we're going to start with quarters, and then we're going to cut each quarter into halves. If you tend to have a smaller cabbage and cutting the quarters in half would be too small, you can always take the quarter and cut it this way. But I like the thinner slices. But again, if your cabbage is small, then you can do that. So the key to keeping that core intact is that it's going to hold the whole thing together. Some of it will fall apart during baking, but this will really keep it hopefully together so we can flip it and make it easier. And I'm just going to place these on the baking sheet. I don't know, there's no crazy process here. I guess the only thing to consider is to not overpack it. You don't want it to, well, we'll get there. We do want it to steam, but you don't want them to be too close. You want them to have enough space so that they can brown. So then I'm going to brush a little bit of oil over top. You can pour this into a bowl and then brush it, or you can drizzle it and brush. I'm just going to drizzle and brush so I don't dirty an extra thing. And I'm going to use my hand to just kind of direct the oil. And if you need more, you can always do that. But then I'm just going to take my brush and brush the edges. So this oil will help, of course, the cabbage from sticking to the pan, but more importantly, it's going to help brown the cabbage once we take the foil off. So then, and then I'm going to season it lightly with some salt, and then we'll flip it and do the same on the second side. This is your only chance to really season the cabbage before you cook it, so you don't want to skip that. Okay. All right, we're going to do just a little bit more oil on the second side. It already has some from being on the baking sheet, so you don't need much. And I recommend seasoning. This is going to be kind of technical, but seasoning it from pretty high up will allow the seasoning to evenly coat it. Whereas if you're seasoning like this, you're just going to get one part really salty. So you want to give it a little bit of space. Some pepper just on top of the cabbage. So then the next step is to take some foil and tightly cover it. The goal with this is to essentially steam roast the cabbage. And I don't think that's a technical term, but it is the term that I have deemed for this recipe. By covering it with foil is it's going to encourage the cabbage to steam a little bit for the first part of cooking. That's going to cook the cabbage through, soften it a little bit, and then we'll take this off and we'll roast it at that really high temperature, and it's going to give it some browning and some texture and some color. Also, this is really particular as well, but I find when I put foil on a pan, it often falls off when I put it in the oven because the foil has been tucked underneath the entire pan. So I recommend to keep it nice and tight, to just tighten it right above the edge of the pan, and then you won't have to deal with that mess and frustration. So then it'll stay nice and tight. It'll steam roast the cabbage. All right, and so I have it at a very high temp, 500 degrees, center rack, for 10 minutes. Okay. So then, now we're gonna start the sauce. Okay. So while the cabbage is steam roasting, we're gonna start with the dressing, the herby sauce that gets spooned over top. It's kind of a cross between a vinaigrette and a sauce. But the first step is to mince up a shallot. And what I like to do with raw shallot, if I'm going to be using quite a bit of it, is to rinse it or soak it in cold water. Raw shallot can be really, really potent, but I still want that raw shallot texture and the flavor. I just don't want people to be like walking around with it 6 days later in their mouth, you know? So this kind of keeps that from happening. Okay, so I'm just gonna mince this like I would mince an onion. You're gonna need 1/2 of a large shallot or 1 normal size shallot. But I do find that you either can find tiny, tiny shallots or huge shallots, so use your discretion. Okay. So loud. Okay, our shallots are finely minced, and now I'm just gonna cover them with some cold water. Make sure it's cold. If it's hot, then they're just gonna get like partially cooked and you don't want them steamed. So we'll set these aside for about 10 minutes, which is perfect because the cabbage cooks for 10 minutes in its first step. So same. Then we will start on mincing up some fresh herbs. This is gonna be also very important to the entire dish. This is part of the vinaigrette. You need about 1/3 cup of minced tender herbs. You can use any tender herb. I'm using some chives. I'm also gonna use some parsley. I'm gonna use majority, probably fresh dill. You can do all of one, a mix of 2, a mix of 3, a mix of 4, etc. You could even do cilantro if you like cilantro. Really, anything goes here. Tarragon would be great. But the most important thing to remember is that you need 1/3 of a cup total. And I'm just gonna mince it up. Okay. Just put that in my 1/3 of a cup. And I'm gonna pack it pretty tight because I want a lot. Ooh. It's hot in there. Okay. So the first 10 minutes of steaming is done. You'll want to carefully remove this and make sure that you're opening it away from you, not in front of you, or you'll get burned. Not the kind of facial you want. Okay. Well, I just did it firstly. You can tell that they're just starting to soften a little bit. Not so much that they're already totally soft because they're going to bake for a little bit longer, or they're going to roast. So they're nice and bright green, and we're going to put them back in for another 10 minutes until they start to get some coloring. Adios. Nice thing about this recipe is you can use any sausage, really. I recommend using a pre-cooked sausage. It just makes life a little bit easier. If you're not using a pre-cooked sausage, I would recommend pan cooking it, boiling it ahead of time, because it's not going to be in the oven long enough for it to cook all the way through. I like to use a beef kielbasa. It's super German. It goes really well with the cabbage. It goes really well with mustard. But you can also use turkey for a little bit of a lighter version. And you can also use chicken sausage. If you do use chicken sausages, I would recommend keeping them whole and just putting them on the baking sheet as is. We're going to slice this up into chunks. So I cut it in half because it's a little unruly. I like to kind of do it at I'm going to slice it into 1/2-inch thick slices. I like to do it on a diagonal just because you get more surface area for browning, which equals more flavor. You can also just cut it into coins, or you could just cut it into like 4 quarters. So you have 4 servings. Okay, those babies are ready. And now we're going to drain our shallots, and we're going to make the dressing in the same bowl the shallots were in. I'm going to let them drain a little bit. I don't want to add too much water. All right, so now in our empty bowl, I'm going to build our vinaigrette. So we're going to start with whole grain mustard. Yum. And we're going to do a whole tablespoon of that. Heaping whole tablespoon. Whole grain mustard isn't that potent like Dijon is. So you can use a lot of it without overpowering things. And then we're going to do 2 teaspoons of Dijon mustard. If you don't want to buy 2 separate products, you can buy just stone ground mustard and do like a pretty heaping tablespoon or even 2 tablespoons, and that'll work just fine. But I like the mix of these because I really like the whole mustard seeds. They add a nice texture, and visually they're really beautiful. We need some sugar. We're gonna do I should not be touching my nose. We need a 1/2 teaspoon of sugar. You can also do honey, really any sweetener that you have on hand. I just like the clean flavor of sugar, and everybody has it on hand. And then we're gonna do some pepper, just like a 1/4 teaspoon. You can always season the entire dish a little bit more later. And then we're gonna add in a 1/4 cup of olive oil. And I'm gonna be using 3 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar. You could also do white wine vinegar, that would be delicious. Red wine vinegar. Okay. That's the base of the vinaigrette. Then we're gonna add in our drained shallots. Okay, and then I'm gonna also add the herbs. Gorgeous. All right, and we're gonna mix it all up. It's gonna be a really thick herby sauce. So if you want it to be more like a vinaigrette, you can add more oil and vinegar. but it's a nice, thick, chunky, spoonable sauce. Pretty. Okay. Ooh. Okay, we're gonna flip these. They have really nice coloring. We're gonna gently flip them so they don't fall apart. Oh my God. Oh, so pretty. The ones on the edges are always so gorgeous and brown. Ooh, hot. And they're staying nice and intact. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna scatter these around, but I do wanna make sure that the cut sides are on the baking sheet so they get nice and brown. Oh, this looks so good. Surprise, surprise, it goes in for another 10 minutes. And then it's nearly done. Sizzle away in there. Okay, so we'll finish this dish with some drained beans. I like to use cannellini beans or navy beans. I don't recommend using chickpeas, aka garbanzo beans, because they're just a little bit drier and they dry out in the hot oven. Okay, those are now on standby. We're almost done. Easy peasy. Ooh. I'm just gonna flip the sausages before we put it back in so they don't get too brown on the bottom side. All right, we're gonna put the drained beans over top. I just sprinkle them over. And then they'll go back into the oven for about 5 minutes, just to warm through. Okay. Last stint in the oven. We are. Doesn't look like much yet, but once we put the sauce on. Make sure every cabbage has a little bit of the sauce, and then that's it. The cabbage is so tender. It has a nice browning to it, so it's flavorful, but it's also tender, but it still holds together, which I think is really important, so it doesn't just fall apart in your mouth. The beans add a little bit of starchiness, and of course the sausage is just savory and salty, and everything is brought together with that really herby, shalloty dressing. It is just delicious. So I'll link the recipe below in the caption. This recipe and all my others are there on zestfulkitchen.com, and I'll be back next week with another everyday gourmet recipe. Should I try it again?
Time's up.